Welcome to our final presentation of this year's speaker series. Fortunately, we have a topic today that is current, and we have one of our own who is presenting, and she is Dr. Patty McDaniel. Let me read her bio. Patty earned her BS and MS from Southeast Missouri State University and her PhD in biology from St. Louis University. Before coming to Jefferson College, Dr. McDaniel taught and held conservation positions in Costa Rica, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Panama. She developed a training program for Latin American professionals in conservation field methods and conservation education programs for primary and secondary school systems. Dr. McDaniel most recently served as coordinator of a major biodiversity project working with indigenous groups and the Nicaraguan government to develop a regional conservation management plan. She currently teaches ecology and environmental conservation, general biology, and concepts in biology here at Jefferson College. And she works with the campus student environmental organizations and the local communities on environmental and conservation issues. I understand she has spent a lot of time in the jungles. In fact, she's named her pet dog Cheetah. And she identifies herself around here as Me Jane.
That's not true.
Let's welcome Patty McDaniel.
Thank you. Thank you. Wayne, anybody who knows me knows that I'd be much more likely to identify myself as me Tarzan. Right? If you know me, you know that's probably the case. I hope the lighting will be okay. I'm not sure. I don't know if we could is there a way to dim the lights just a little bit, maybe? I think it will make it easier to see. I'm not sure if that's possible, but I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Friday's Speaker Series. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon, and I felt really honored to be asked to present today on a topic that is near and dear to my heart and that I've spent some years working in before I came to Jefferson College. And my goal today is just to give us a little background. And is it too dark? Does everybody? I say this to my students. Are you going to fall asleep on me now? Right? So we can raise the lights up if we need to. But I've taught, in various areas of ecology and environmental conservation, been involved in research projects for some years. And what I hope to do today is a couple of things. First of all, I'm not here to preach to anyone, just to offer information, right? Information that I've gathered from some years of doing research and working in these fields. And I hope give us information to empower us to make whatever decisions we choose to make from the information we have. As I tell my students, information and knowledge is power, right? What you do with that is your own decision, but it's hard to make decisions without the information behind us. So that's my goal today. All right, so I'll start a little bit with just a very brief history of environmental issues and environmentalism in the United States. And then talk about, and I would be negligent as an instructor if I didn't spend some time talking about some of the major issues we have on the planet. Okay, I feel that's necessary. And someone asked me, when you do this, could you give us some startling facts? Well, it is a bit of a shock and awe campaign that I've put together, not to depress you and make you feel as though there's nothing to do, but once again to give us information and knowledge so we can affect whatever change we choose to affect and implement in our lives. And then lastly, the last part, I wanted to spend some time, and I thought that in this economic climate, we're all looking for ways to save money. And I think a lot of people were worried that, given the economic climate, one of the things likely to suffer as a result of that would be the environment, right? That we wouldn't have the money to invest. And so what I tried to do was put together a few ways that we within our homes and institutions can save money and help save the environment at the same time. Okay, so that's the sort of the essence of my presentation today. And maybe in order to save time, because I'll go through this quickly, but I won't have time to stop for questions at each slide. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to entertain those. So maybe if you take a minute to try to remember those or jot those down, if you have those questions, I'll entertain those at the end. Does that sound reasonable to everyone as a plan? Okay, all right, so thank you once again for the opportunity to be here. Welcome again to Friday Speaker Series. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, I thought this was apropos when I saw this, right? Do you want to stop reading those ingredients while we're trying to eat? So everyone has finished eating, right? Okay, good, right? And as I say to my colleagues in biology, it takes a lot to ruin a biologist's appetite. We can eat through almost anything. And for us, if you've ever had lunch with a biologist, no topic is off limits, as anyone can testify who's had lunch with a biologist here on the campus. So we talk through anything, nothing really bothers us, but it does bother other individuals. So we've had our lunch, and I thought this cartoon worked well because I sort of feel like this individual, right? The mom standing over reading the ingredient. Here's another bad ingredient, right? Here's another piece of information. And the family is, oh, please don't tell us anymore. Just let us eat our food and be happy, right? And for a lot of us, I think that's sort of how we operate. It's much easier and you enjoy your food much better if you don't necessarily read all the ingredients that's contained therein, right? I love my little frozen lean cuisine until I turn it over and read about 150 ingredients that it's listed on the back, for example, right? So I thought this was apropos. Okay, continuing on. Okay. Well, the topic today is going green. And when I was asked for a title for this, I was trying to think, what's a good title? What's a good title? And we hear so much negative information about what's going on in the environment, and we hear it because we can't ignore the facts and information and what's happening out there. But however, I wanted to sort of make it, so I was thinking going, gone. I was like, no, going green. So if we concentrate on going green, maybe we can keep things from being going gone. So that's why I picked that for a title. So going green. And the first thing, this is sort of the outline of things I hope to cover today. Some of our views, just briefly, views of nature protection in the United States may be something most of us really don't know much about. Some current environmental issues we have. And then how we can go green and save money at the same time, okay? Well, here's our beautiful home. Is it not gorgeous, right? Look at it, amazing planet we live on. And I put this on just so we know where we are, right? And I say that, sort of jokingly, but there's a point to this. We are here. Now, I didn't go to Google and figure out if that's the exact, so don't, all you geography people go, that's not exactly where we're located. We're on the wrong side of the Mississippi River. No, the point is, we are here representing one incredibly minute little dot, right, on this amazing planet that we have. That's our location. So one of the things I think it's important for us to do these days is put ourselves in context of how we represent only a teeny tiny portion of life on this amazing planet we have, right? So I'd like to start with some views of nature protection, looking at sort of our series of stages we've gone through in the United States regarding how we view nature and our resources. First of all, a brief history. And this is just a question, just for the heck of it. Does anybody have any idea how long ago we received the first written sort of recorded observations of environmental problems? Anybody have any idea? Anybody want to guess? 70s? Anybody else? Prehistoric? Anybody else? The only thing that would prohibit that probably would be written, right? I mean, written. What? Anybody else? During the Industrial Revolution, that's a very common answer, right, is that. We tend to think of it as being very recent. The first recorded writings of environmental damage date from 400 BC and Plato, right? Plato acknowledging the problems in Greece from deforestation and what that seemed to be doing. So most people are surprised to realize that it dates much, much further back in our history. People first becoming aware of what was going on the planet. So that tends to be really surprising and shocking for students. Okay, so that history, that would be our global history. Now, if we look at the United States, our brief history, right, we're a young nation here. Our history and our view of resources has gone through a few different phases. First of all, and we're talking about basically late 1800s, early 1900s, when people first started becoming aware of using resources and what was going on the planet with resource issues. So the first stage is sort of characterized, or we call them stages or environmental ethics, and some of these sort of overlapped one another. The first stage we call the pragmatic resource conservation stage. I know that pragmatic resource use, it just means sort of logical use of resources. And conservation meaning we're using resources, right? And I always try to differentiate between conservation and preservation because those are two different things. If you think about the Missouri Department of Conservation, right, it's use in conservation areas, so that's what conservation is. It's using resources, but in a very, right, limited fashion that retains nature's processes. That's conservation. Preservation is basically sort of a hands-off idea. We have preserves, for example, and in preserves you would expect people are not hunting, right, and taking organisms, so sort of differentiating between those. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had this pragmatic resource conservation ethic or stage, and it was exemplified by sort of the U.S. Forestry Service in the United States, right? Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt, right? Individuals who were using resources and advocated the use of resources on the planet. We call that the pragmatic look at a resource. And then we follow that, right, with the next sort of stage that overlapped the end of this, and we call this the moral and aesthetic preservation ethic or stage. And the idea here was to look at resources not so much in a utilitarian fashion or them being useful, but the beauty and the value that nature has in and of itself without it necessarily needing to be useful, right? I mean, makes sense? So those two sort of different ways of looking at that. So this is sort of characterized by individuals like John Muir, right? Development of the Sierra Club, Aldo Leopold and some of his writings about nature and natural resources. So sort of a different view of looking at nature. The third stage we entered, and this is probably exemplified by the early 60s and those wacky hippies, right? Everybody remembers sort of from the 1960s. Well, the idea here is that we hit what we called the age of modern environmentalism. It was when people became really aware of what was going on and they started pushing for legislation, so litigation and lawsuits became really important, making people be accountable for how they were using resources and what was happening as a result of resource use. So we saw widespread litigation, lots of writings, right, like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, so important in sort of opening our eyes to the use of DDT as a pesticide, right, in the United States, and the effect that had on wildlife. And you can still, right, her book is still available to this day. So there were some individuals that were very influential in opening our eyes in the early 60s to what was going on with use of resources, pollution from that, and the ever-growing human population on the planet. Okay? Well, we've moved out of that stage, and now we're in a stage called global environmentalism. Global environmentalism now has us looking at environmental issues on this idea, right? Here's the idea. We're all in this together, and what happens to the planet is in our hands, basically. The idea is we're all interconnected, and no one gets out of this without being impacted by and impacting other individuals and other species on the planet, right? This is our home. We all live on this amazing home and we all share it. So not only, and I know it's the age of the global economy, right? So playing into this idea once again is this interconnectedness on our planet between living things and our resource use. Okay? The topics about some of the environmental issues that we have currently on the planet, I've taken from the United Nations. The United Nations every once in a while puts out a list of some of the top environmental dilemmas they see on the planet. It's called the UN Assessment on the State of the Global Environment. And this is on the UN's hit parade of issues, right? First of all, I mean, obvious, we've had a burgeoning human population growth. It's starting to slow, the rate is starting to slow, and that's very good news for the planet. That's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on these set of environmental issues that the United Nations has listed as some of the most important and critical that we deal with. Our use and shortages of some resources. First of all, and most people are really surprised by this, number one on the United Nations list of environmental issues that will plague us in the nearest future will be water problems. It'll be shortage of water and water pollution issues. Next, energy, obtaining and using energy. Now the rest of these are in no specific order, right? Air pollution, okay? Biodiversity loss, which essentially means the loss of life forms on the planet. And I'll start with water use and pollution. And two of probably my main areas that I've become most concerned about, and if any students have had my ecology and environmental conservation class, it would be water problems we have and loss of diversity, loss of life forms on the planet, because that's where most of my research has been, dealing with biodiversity issues, looking at the living forms and what's going on. But to start a little bit with water use and pollution, unfortunately, right, we're now seeing areas that used to be pristine areas on the planet becoming polluted, such that even in areas such as our national parks, we're finding areas so polluted now that there's no swimming or wading even allowed in those. So it's a pervasive issue. Okay, and then I have a series for each of these, some facts. Okay, some might be a little striking, but we can't ignore the facts, right? The facts are the facts, but I think it helps us understand and helps us decide what are we able and willing to do, right, to help our environment. So did you know, right, according to the United Nations, this will probably be the single most critical environmental issue on the planet currently that we have, okay, right? Here's the estimation. By the year 2025, 75% of the global population will face water shortages or polluted water. In other words, insufficient water, whether it comes from water shortages or polluted, unusable water, 75% of the global population. It wasn't too many years ago that value was 2/3, or about 66%. It's already jumped to 75%. And as the United Nations listens, a student of mine just said the other day, you know, after you said that, I was reading an article in National Geographic that said water wars will probably be one of the next type of wars we have on the planet. He said, I remember you talking about that stuff, and sure enough, they were saying that. So water is going to be a huge issue. We tend to not think of that so much in the United States, right? Because we tend to be a water wealthy nation. If we had to compare ourselves globally with some other places on the planet, we have some good water reserves. But we do know, right, that there are places in the United States that have been facing water shortages. And one of the areas we're concerned about is one of the biggest water catchment areas we have in the United States is what we call an aquifer. It's an underground area where water is captured and then it's stored and then it's drawn off for use. The largest aquifer in the United States runs from the Dakotas down through northern Texas. And within about the last 40 years, we now know that that aquifer is 50% depleted. So using it up incredibly quickly, as it turns out. And here's what we don't tend to understand or think about with water. It's the old adage I tell the students, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Has anybody ever heard that? Like my mom, grandma used to say that, you know, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Well, it's because almost all water on the planet is salt water. And of the water on the planet, only about 2.4% of our water on the planet is fresh water. And of that 2.4%, only 10% is liquid usable water for us. So you can see how we have dramatically reduced the available water we have to draw from for human use and consumption. Okay? And I love to put this up. This is one of my little mantras. If anybody's ever been in one of my classes, this is true. The largest user of water in U.S. domestic sector is flushing toilets. Flushing toilets. That's one of my pet peeves, is flushing toilets. So I always say, and I'll let you fill in the rest, if it's yellow, let it mellow, and then da-da-da-da, flush it down, okay? That's the idea, and as I tell my students, it is not nuclear waste. It can sit in the toilet bowl, right, until the next time, and then be flushed down because you save a huge amount of water that way. Not only water use, but water in amount of savings, right? If you are on a water system, a city water system, you pay for X gallons, and you literally are flushing water down the toilet. That's unnecessary. So in the United States, 38% of our domestic water use comes from flushing toilets. Something really effective we can do is flush the toilet every other time we use it, right, if possible. We save a huge number of gallons just on a daily basis that way. So you save water and you'll notice a lowering in your water bill at the same time. Okay, bathing happens to be 31%, the next largest user. So at the end, I have a couple of props and things that I'll show you guys and we'll talk a little bit about as ways that we can help sort of conserve and take care of some of these issues. Okay, next. Well, here's a biggie, folks, unfortunately. Herbicides and pesticides that are being used out there, right, primarily on crops and things, are acting as what we call EDCs, endocrine disrupting contaminants, right? What does that mean essentially? It means they're interfering with normal body functioning. And I only say this because it has been brought to light as of late of a major issue we have, and I believe, Sarah, I talked to some of you guys, there's a film that's covering this that's being sponsored by another group. The film deals with the most widely used herbicide in the United States called atrazine and the effects we're seeing on organisms, and that film is being shown, I think, at 2 p.m. in the library, if I'm not mistaken, if anybody's interested in more information. Well, the pesticides and herbicides seem to be interfering with how our bodies are functioning. And atrazine happens to be a major culprit for this, okay? And I looked online, right, to look at where Missouri stands in its use and application of atrazine. And the good news is, see, there's some good news out there. The good news is Missouri is in one of the lowest tiers of use of atrazine. Here's the bad news. Oh, it's a shame, but there is some bad news. Illinois stands alone at the top in its use of atrazine. There are no other states even close to Illinois in the use of atrazine. What does that mean for us? Anybody see any connection there? It hits the Mississippi River system, right? So once again, the idea is we're really good in our atrazine use, but we border a state who is highest off the charts in terms of atrazine use. Well, what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, and the film deals with this that I think people are going to see. Unfortunately, researchers started noticing this in the late 1980s. There were some researchers who were studying alligators in the Everglades, and they started noticing when they were finding male alligators that the male alligators did not look like normal male alligators. In fact, they said these alligators look like they're becoming feminized, right? Feminized. What that means is male alligators were starting to look like female alligators. Okay, this was in the late 80s, right? And so once again, as happens, it takes a while for research to get to the point where it becomes common knowledge in mainstream society and people start paying attention. So it's been out there for a long time. It was not too long ago, too many years ago, a researcher by the name of Tyrone Hayes blew the lid off of what was going on. It's the use of atrazine. What he found is he's finding frogs all over the United States, and his model is amphibians. And the frogs that are exposed to normal allowed amounts of atrazine are becoming females. They're turning into females. We call them becoming estrogenized, right? Because a lot of these herbicides and pesticides act like estrogen female hormones. They're getting into the male system and they're turning the males into females. We see male frogs that are they're laying eggs actually. And he's finding male frogs that are being mounted by other male frogs because the male frog is essentially a female. So he's finding male frogs with testicular tissue developing eggs and hatching young. So we now have a situation where we actually have, in all essence, sort of two males, right, producing offspring. And this became a real concern, right, because he's seeing this all over with frogs. Why does that matter to us? Frogs are a bellwether, right, a bellwether organism for what's going on in the environment because they have porous skins, right? They absorb air and water through the skins. They breathe through lungs, right, also, but they take in through the skin as well. And so whatever is in the environment, they end up incorporating into their bodies, right? So he started noticing this, and sure enough, now today he was the whistleblower on this. Since that happened, unfortunately, it's now happening in human males, right? Studies have shown that when you start at the headwaters of the Mississippi River system and you follow it down to the Gulf of Mexico, the farther down the Mississippi River system you get, the more sperm deformities and lack of sperm production and increased breast tissue formation they're finding in human males, right? Because it's acting the same way, right? In humans, it's acting as estrogens. So males are essentially becoming feminized, right? And so not only does it tend to feminize organisms, it can also go beyond that and create, be disease, causes for disease, right? Cancers, increased reproductive cancers. And somebody might ask, and a reasonable question would be, why males? Why do we know this in males? Males are an easier model to gather this information from. Does that make sense, right? We take sperm samples. It's easier to gather than information as from female organisms. But nevertheless, so we have a lot of these contaminants. So that's a big issue right now in the United States, is the use of atrazine as an herbicide and pesticides and other herbicides as well. Okay, and just a couple of little tidbits of information, right? In the United States, 200 million liters of waste motor oil are poured into sewers are allowed to seep into the ground every year. 200 million liters of oil. And just as a breakdown of, I know this is not oil, it's gasoline, but here's the conversion. As little as 1 liter of gasoline contaminates 1 million liters of water and turns it into undrinkable, unusable water. Okay? Next, the idea of what happens when we try to obtain and use energy on the planet, right? Well, did you know that globally, our oil reserves are expected to last only about another 35, 40 years max? And with the increasing industrialization of China and India, the expectations are now that it will last much less time than that, right? Now we're looking at maybe 30 years, a little over 30. This is of known exploitable oil reserves on the planet, okay? Doesn't count the ones we're not aware of yet, right? Or that are unexploitable. We can't get to them or use them for some reason. In the United States, we have less than 5% of the global population in the United States, but we consume, and I tried to make an average to be fair here. I've seen values as high as 40%, and I've seen values as low as 20 to 25%. So I put an average, right? Consumes about 30% of the world's gasoline. So we're big consumers in the United States, of course, and I always say, well, the United States is very spread out, isn't it, right? We have an amazing country. And we're spread out, we have lots of space, we haven't filled it all up yet, and so we tend to use more gasoline, a lot of which is used in just day-to-day transportation, right? Well, studies are showing that fossil fuel use, coal, oil, things like that, natural gas, are contributing to global warming, right? We're seeing an increase in global temperature. The expectation is that we'll see anywhere between 2.7 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit increase by the year 2100. I think we've already seen a 1-point-something degree increase, if I'm not mistaken. And unfortunately, we tend to think of oil and global reserves dealing mostly with using energy, but even in transporting energy, right, 1 billion barrels of oil are spilled or purposely discharged annually into our oceans. So that's a big deal and a big cause of concern and pollution, right? And now here's something I do want to spend a little bit of time on. It takes about 1.5 million barrels of oil to produce the United States' annual supply of bottled water. 1.5 million barrels of oil to produce the U.S. annual supply of bottled water. So just a couple of things, if I could, right, elaborate on this. First of all, right, and this is what we're talking about, right, this idea, bottled water, okay, and we're talking about the cost used not only in production, right, but then in transportation, right, packaging and transportation of bottled water. And one of the problems that we found, and I'll hit on this a little bit later, is every plastic bottle that goes into a landfill takes 700 years to start decomposing. 700 years in a closed landfill to decompose a plastic bottle. And about minimally 80 to 85% of plastic bottles that are produced end up in landfills every year. So it is a big issue. One of the other things I think I'd like to mention is, I think most people expect, right, understandably, that when they purchase bottled water, they're getting a somehow purer product than they do out of their own water systems. That really is a misnomer, right? In most cases, the bottled water regulations are much more lax than are your municipal water system standards. So in many cases, people are literally fooling themselves by thinking that they're purchasing a purer product. So one thing that you might consider doing is, first of all, you know, I have one bottle that I use all the time for that, and I put at home, if you're concerned about impurities in your system, I put on my system a really simple little water purification thing. So it filters out, and it even says on the back it filters out atrazine, right, and all the things. It lists a huge number of things that are filtered out these days. The water filtration systems have become so good that you can purchase now. They filter out 99.9% of pollutants. So you get a water filtration system in a bottle like this, and then you're not using the bottles, right? You're assured of really pure water. You're filtering it yourself, and you're saving a lot of energy, and you're also saving a lot of money in purchasing, right, cases and cases of bottled water. So that's something, right, that you might want to consider as an option. Next, right, just to let you know the importance of recycling. In the case of recycling aluminum cans, we save about 15 million barrels of oil per year from recycling aluminum cans. That is excellent and awesome, because making new cans from old ones takes 95% less energy than making new aluminum cans. So that's a huge savings, right, in energy consumption and oil use. Right? And I think this is interesting. So I had to be really picky and choosy. There is no shortage of facts. There is no shortage of shocking facts, right? I just pulled out some that I thought might be a little bit eye-opening and that some we could relate to. If 20% of the United States stopped using plastic bags, we could save 80 million gallons of oil per year. If only 20% of the United States stopped using plastic bags. So what we're talking about, right, and as it turns out, we're going to help everybody at the end, or as many people as we can, get started with this idea. So we have a bag and information, and while there may not be enough to cover everyone, I would, maybe a suggestion would be that we offer them first to our guests who are here from outside the college system, right? So if you're interested, one is available for you. I also brought some extras myself and offering these up as a way to get us started on this idea. If we can start using these bags, once you purchase one of these, they tend to be very heavy duty these days, and they last for an incredibly long time. You can use these over and over and over again for years. And what I found is They hold even more than those little plastic bags, and they don't have holes in the bottom, and you get home and I'm just like, where was my eyeliner, right? Where was my dog bone? You know, it's gone. I lost it someplace because they always have, sometimes they have holes in them. So if even 20% stopped using plastic bags, we save 80 million gallons of oil per year. So as you know, as the saying goes, paper or plastic? Neither. Neither is the idea. It's like neither, because I have my own bags right here to use. And I was asked this question the other day. They were like, well, you know, we have paper, so if you're asked paper or plastic, which is better? And this is contrary to what most people think. Most people think you should pick paper, right? Isn't that what most people think? You should pick paper. If those are your only two options, you're better off taking plastic. I know it seems doesn't it seem contrary to what we would expect? That's because most paper bags produced and used as grocery bags in the United States are made from virgin tree fibers. Virgin meaning they typically don't use recycled fibers for brown paper bags because they're not considered strong enough to be able to hold up under the weight of all the groceries. So they're using virgin fibers and not recycled. So if those are your only options, a plastic bag, right, is the way to go. And then hopefully maybe you use those and then you recycle those. There are recycling bins we see now to recycle your plastic bags. So once again, let's not forget we have some available for people. Okay. And next, air pollution, just a little bit. I hope everyone isn't tiring too much of these factoids yet, right? I'm working my way through these. Air pollution is another major issue we face on the planet, right? Air pollution, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, it's the most widespread type of environmental damage we have on the planet. Well, it's the most widespread because of air currents, right, circulating the planet. And this is just a good example of how we're so connected globally. Check this out. On any given day, 75% of West Coast pollution, primarily California, can be traced to Asian origins, right? Starts in Asia, blows around, makes its way to the United States, to the West Coast, basically, right? And the United States, they're globally, I mean, I'm focusing on the United States. It's not that we're the only ones putting these pollutants into the air. China now exceeds the United States in producing some of these pollutants. The United States adds about, and the number in the metric tons isn't important, it's just that the amounts are very large. U.S. produces about 147 million metric tons of air pollutants each year in the atmosphere. That doesn't count carbon dioxide, by the way. And power plants, right? Power plants and transportation are the primary sources of this. And I put this up here, not to take a lot of time, but just to use one little example of what's going on. We know that mercury is a byproduct of some emissions problems we have, and coal use is one, right? So we're seeing mercury contamination. It's turning into the most common degradation we're seeing in the rivers and streams in the United States. In a 2007 study, they collected 2,700 fish from 600 rivers and streams in the western part of the United States. Every single fish was shown to have mercury in it. There were no fish without mercury. Well, what that's translating into for human consumption is that the U.S. National Institute of Health estimates that 1 out of 12 women in the United States have elevated levels of mercury in their system, and that's translating into almost 500,000 children being born each year with already dangerously high levels of mercury in them. And it's costing the United States, and if we always want a bottom line, the cost. This itself costs the United States $8.7 billion per year to deal with trying to fix and help these children, right, that are born as a result of this one particular type of contamination, okay? And in the United States, we had about 500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide gases into the air each year. About 2/3 of these come from our internal combustion engines and transportation, right? Not essentially burning everything up in the process. So maybe you start getting an idea of why people are pushing for alternative energy sources, new types of automobiles where we can switch from fossil fuel use and dependency to another, right, more sustainable type of fuel use. Globally, we have huge amounts of carbon dioxide, and it's primarily from fossil fuel use, but this we forget or don't think too much about. A good chunk of that comes from burning tropical forests and forests in general throughout the planet, right? Slashing and burning huge amounts of tropical forest. That adds an enormous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, yet we seem to concentrate solely on that produced, right, primarily from processing and transportation. Fortunately for us, and this is good news, our terrestrial, our land and ocean ecosystems are wonderful at helping to try to clean our environment. And that's why they're so important to us. As I say to my students, if I have another mantra, it's we lovey the greenie, right? And I don't mean dollars, I mean plants. We love plants. We're intimately connected to them. They help absorb, they're called carbon sinks. They take all this excess carbon dioxide, suck it out of the atmosphere, and use it, right, to make their food. And then we consume that food, basically. Okay. Next, biodiversity loss. This would be sort of the problems we're having with losing life forms on the planet, losing different species. And two of the most threatened systems we have, right, are these, our tropical forests and our coral reef systems. They're the two most diverse on the planet. In other words, they hold the most different types of life forms on our planet. Tropical forests and coral reefs, amazing, beautiful, right? And a lot of people ask, well, why have you spent so much time in tropical locations working? And it's not because it's particularly easy or exotic. It's because this is where the vast bulk of the global diversity lies, and it's because it's being destroyed so quickly, right? That's the real thing, okay? And this is something I think we tend to forget. All food comes from other organisms, right? We don't manufacture our own food inside ourselves. We get that from other places, right? And that we depend on other organisms for our food. And as I say to students, and think about the lunch we had today, we either eat plants, we eat something that has eaten plants, or we eat something that has eaten something that has eaten plants. Does that make sense? It's hard to come up. I mean, that's the way it works, folks. It's like, let me think about that. That is the case. So they form the basis of the food chain on the planet, right? Habitat loss, disappearing habitat is the #1 global threat to species on the planet. Losing habitat, whether it's outright destruction or whether it's pollution, right, the intertwining of some of these issues. Nevertheless, it's loss of habitat. That's the #1 threat to diversity. And this is surprising to most people. The #2 direct threat to habitat, to diversity loss on the planet is introduced, what we call exotic, right? Exotic species. Species that you wouldn't normally find in that location, brought in. A good example would be kudzu vine. Anybody heard of kudzu vine? Anybody know about the invasive properties of kudzu vine? It is a phenomenal plant. It certainly works well for what it was designed. It was imported from Asia, I think by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, wasn't it the 1940s, something like that, late 40s, maybe early 50s, as a way to help stop erosion. And what they didn't count on is, in many cases, invasive exotic species, when they're introduced, aren't part of the evolution of the habitat where these organisms have been spending eons of time together figuring out what role everybody plays in the environment. In comes a new one. And in the case of kudzu vine, I say it looks like, have you ever seen these green blankets, everything along the highway from here to the East Coast? You start traveling from here through Tennessee to the Carolinas, and you see these blankets of green along the side of the highway, and that's kudzu vine. It is so invasive and aggressive, it covers everything. And once it starts, it's really difficult to control. Our Missouri Department of Conservation keeps a really good track of kudzu vine in Missouri. And once reports, I see some heads shaking, once reports, if anybody sees kudzu vine, to report it, because you have to catch it early. Once it becomes established, it tends to overgrow everything. So we really kind of forget about this significance. And one of the things when we talk about diversity loss, we're losing species on the planet. And Missouri, I wonder if, do you think Missouri has rare, threatened, and endangered species? Anybody feel like probably you think so? Yeah? Could I have a volunteer? Could I have a volunteer? Anybody? Come on up. I have to pick on one of my students. I have to. Okay, so if you could take this and you walk one direction. Okay. So you walk that way. Oh, you're fast. Hey, don't drop it. I've done that before. It rolls back up on itself and we have to do it all over again. Are you at your end? Okay, all right. Anybody have any idea what this is? The list of Missouri's rare, threatened, and endangered species. Missouri. This is not the United States, this is not the globe, this is our state list. 1 out of 6 species in Missouri is rare, threatened, or endangered of the known species that we have. So sometimes we forget sort of what's going on in our own backyard. So we start thinking more about the old adage, think globally, because we're all in this together, act locally, right? And in a lot of cases, acting locally means we start at home, right? We start at home, we start in our communities, we start on our own campus, and that's the way we start affecting change. So I just think this is a good visual aid. It sort of brings home the idea, are you kidding me? Most people figure there are only a few. About 925, almost 1 out of 6 of Missouri species are rare, threatened, or endangered. Can I leave this with you and you'll continue? Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. All right. In the past 300 years, this is in the United States, 50,000 non-native species, right, have been established. 50,000 non-native species, what we would call exotic species, have been established. And I don't know if anybody's watched the news in the last weeks or months. Has anybody happened to see the article about all the pythons and boas in Florida? Yeah, there have been so many released in Florida from people buying them as little pets and then releasing them. They're reaching lengths of 18 to 20 feet. They're eating all the wildlife in the Florida Everglades, and now they're swimming to the Keys. And so they're now training meter readers, male persons in the Keys on how to capture. And yeah, that's a good job, right? It's like, I don't know if I want to volunteer. Step aside, please. Why don't you do that? But teaching anybody who's interested on how to capture these snakes because they're invasive and they're growing like crazy because the conditions are great. And they're showing up like in Miami, they're swimming along the shoreline and ending up in the Keys. And they cost the United States, right? Cost the United States $138 billion annually to try to deal with exotic invasive species that don't even belong here, but that have been come over here or are being sold here, right? $138 billion. That's a huge amount of money. And always think about how could that translate that into jobs, right? What could we do with that money, sort of thing. And just as an aside, we forget there are other ways that we can lose species. It's estimated that like 2 to 3 million waterfowl, ducks, geese, things like that, die annually just from lead poisoning in the water, from bullets and things, right, disintegrating in the water and making toxic levels, or them actually eating it. It's estimated we're losing about 27,000 species per year globally, and probably at least one plant species goes extinct every day. That's also important because we tend to forget 50% of the medicines that we use here in the United States have some natural component to them, and in often cases, it's plant-based components, right? You could think of that aspirin, right, digitalis for heart, the list goes on and on. Vinblastine, vincristine for leukemia. I mean, huge numbers of medicines we have, plant-based, okay? This is also a little disturbing right now. We talk about overfishing, what's happening in the oceans. Globally, 76% of our principal fishing zones across the planet are exhausted of fish. So we're overfishing things as well. And I put this in only because we tend to forget about what's going on in aquatic systems. What's going on in water, it's happening on water and on land. Okay, and lastly, just a little bit about habitat loss, since it's the number one on why we're losing life forms, right? Well, each year an area of about the size of the state of Florida of tropical forest is destroyed across the globe, right? Why do we care about that? And I think these are reasonable questions for people to ask, and I often play devil's advocate in the classroom. I'm like, so what? Right? Taking an unpopular position, so what? What does that mean to us? Well, globally, what it means is we're losing tropical forest at a rate that by the year 2050, it's estimated there will be little to no more tropical forests left on the planet. That helps regulate our global climate, right? For example, very important role they have. And, oh, here's a good little tidbit. If every household in the United States purchased one roll of recycled paper towels, we could save, I said have, that should be save. We can have or save 1.4 million trees. If just each household purchased one roll, that's not switch to recycled paper towels your whole life. That's just one roll, we save 1.4 million trees. And once again, coral reefs being our second most diverse system on the planet, 30% have been declared dead by the United Nations, and by 2030, the expectation is that'll reach 60% on the planet. Sorry, I did have one more. Everybody's like, isn't she done yet? Well, we have solid and hazardous waste. One last little thing. Right? Did you know that when we create 2 pounds of consumer goods, it creates 10 pounds of waste? So we don't get a very good turnaround, right, for our effort that we have. And in the United States, we tend to generate average about 5 to 6 pounds of solid waste per person per day. And in the United States, ways to dispose of trash is getting more and more expensive. We're running out of landfill space, basically. And of course, people then don't want landfills around their areas, right? But in the United States, it now costs about $10 billion per year to dispose of trash. By the year 2018, the estimates it'll cost $100 billion per year, which is just a reflection of us having less land in which to put trash in. And this is a biggie. In the United States, 200 billion food and beverage containers are thrown into landfills each year. 200 billion food and beverage containers. 8 out of 10, right? Once again, 8 out of 10 plastic bottles generated becomes landfill waste, okay? And of course, I already told you, right? Start decomposing takes a long time. In the United States, we end up consuming about 100 billion plastic bags annually, so this is where it really comes in nice if we can even start with baby steps by only one bag. Maybe we can't afford to buy a bunch of bags, but maybe even just starting with one. 55 million pounds of packaging are dumped into oceans every year. 55 million pounds, that's a lot. And I was talking to Scott Holzer about this the other day, talking about circulating around the Hawaiian Islands is a garbage dump that contains 3 million tons of garbage. It's the size of the state of Texas, and it's not even generated by the Hawaiians. It's generated from Mexico, Japan, and a few remote locations in the United States. So a size of Texas floating around Hawaii, and it's not even their garbage. In addition, 330 million pounds of fishing gear is either purposely tossed overboard or discarded per year. This is having, of course, a lot of different impacts. And this is something that you guys are addressing here on the campus. And I don't have a piece of paper, but I think there's one on the table, right? Do you see this? In the United States, good, if everybody's holding that up. In the United States, e-waste, what we now call electronic waste, with the advent of computers and all that thing. E-waste is the largest growing sector of landfill waste in the United States these days. And we're having a recycling, right? Don't we have that coming up? What date is that? The 15th, right, is bring your electronics to campus day to be recycled so they don't end up in a landfill. Why? Well, there's a lot going into landfills, and what's happening when we put them into landfills is those break down and release the heavy metals, which comprise part of the components. Lead, mercury, cadmium, tin, right? This represents, of the heavy metals we find in landfills, 70% is a result of e-waste being thrown in. Okay? Now, here we come. Well, given these problems, what then shall we do, right? What should we do? Well, essentially, the idea is in general for us to think about becoming sustainable consumers, right? Sustainable users of resources. In other words, and this is a catchphrase or a catchword of the sort of the current era, is sustainability. The idea is that we agree to use resources to meet our needs without jeopardizing the next generation and future generations' ability to use resources as well. In other words, we don't use everything up so our kids and our grandkids don't have anything to use, right? We become sustainable, right? What does that mean? We'll talk a little bit about that, okay? Well, the 3 R's, right? That's what we really emphasize in resource use. And when people see this symbol, right? Everybody familiar with this symbol? You see the 3 arrows? And I think everybody tends to think the arrows mean, and they do, sort of form a cycle there, right? That's the idea. But those 3 arrows stand for 3 distinctly different things, and we call them the 3 R's. The idea is reduce, reuse, and recycle. And in that sequence, that ends up being an important sequence to think about. So here's the idea. Reducing, it means we reduce consumption of resources. We slow down the rate at which we use resources up. That is the most effective thing we can do on the planet, is reduce our consumption. So we use less water, electricity, gasoline, packaging. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Next most effective is reusing something, right? Using something again over and over. You use products for another different additional use, right, or purpose. You reuse your paper, your plastic, glass. Furniture you fix, right, instead of throwing into a landfill. Clothing we recycle, take to clothing shops. It can be given to individuals, right, or other people can purchase that clothing. And then third is recycle. And everybody, I mean, that surprises people. It's like, why is recycle third on the list? Well, it's because recycling takes energy, right? It costs, it takes energy. So if to be most effective, we reduce consumption. The second is, once we have something in our hand, we reuse it. And then third, we turn it in, not into a landfill, but we turn it into a recycling center so it can be turned into another product, but we need to understand that that consumes energy as well when we do that. So we like to emphasize the first two, right? And of course, these are some of the most common things we can recycle these days. Okay, now here are little light bulbs. So what I tried to do is I took a series of things that related into kind of saving some parts of the environment and helping people save money at the same time, okay? So first of all, you can save $80 per year in 260 plastic bottles if you, now this takes into account the money spent on the alternative, if you purchase a water purification system, right, and a reusable bottle, okay? And not purchasing cases of bottled water. So reusable plastic bottle means, and now these days, we need to be a little cautious about that. As it turns out, plastic isn't just plastic. As it turns out, plastic bottles are now being shown to leach chemicals out of them, right? And people who started becoming real concerned, really the big pushers were we found a substance called BPAs, bisphenol, I see some head shaking, bisphenol A's in baby bottles, right? In baby bottles, leaching out of baby bottles. And the hotter they get, the more they leach, right? The substance leaches out. So bisphenol A's have been linked to prostate problems in males, developmental problems in children, right? They also tend to act as estrogens once they get into your system, and plastics will leach that into the substance unless it's labeled non-leaching plastic. So the plastics that are being consumed, plastic bottles, and the closer the number is to 7, the greater the leaching capacity of that plastic, right? So if you're drinking out of a number 7 bottle, for example, you want to now purchase, and like I tell my students, it's a consumer-driven economy. fathers became outraged that the baby bottles were, leaching this compound. And so we started seeing BPA-free baby bottles. And I've talked to people that are like, yeah, our doctor even recommended to us that we buy BPA-free bottles for our baby because we were pregnant, getting ready to give birth. So if it's a number 7, for example, it's the worst for leaching, unless it says non-leaching. And this is a non-leaching bottle. I've had this bottle for about 8 years. And it says non-leaching on it, so you know it's not leaching the chemicals into your body. And that's an important thing. When we think about plastics, a lot of doctors are now recommending that mothers with small children and in general start limiting the use of plastic toys and chew toys for infants, right? That there are plastics of other grades that leach chemicals out of the plastics. So, but we can save money by doing this: a purification system, your water bottle, even changing a filter. You can save an additional $325 per year in 260 plastic bottles if you purchase this system, you've already invested in it maybe, and not purchasing vending machine drinks. In other words, you sort of bring your own liquids with you. And then, this regards electricity consumption. Studies have shown that a big user of electricity in the United States is what we call phantom load. We lose maybe up to 5%, right, of electricity costs per month is phantom load. This would be our appliances that are off, but they're still plugged in. They still draw electricity, and they're still costing us energy. They're still costing us money. Okay, we can save $200 per year by purchasing and using rechargeable batteries. Those are the ones, once again, it costs a little more up front, but this is what you're saving in the long run. And that's only if you listen to a CD player, for example, for 2 hours per day, right? And this is a big deal when we talk about water use within our own homes. We can do the toilet flushing every other time. Another thing that's important is we can save up to $250 per year by purchasing what we call a low-flow shower head. And before I moved here, I lived in Arizona. Anybody who spent time in Arizona knows about the water situation out west. There are many water wars already going on out west, folks, fighting over the Colorado River. So everybody out there had low-flow shower heads and limited water use. And so when I got here to Missouri, I went locally and asked for a low-flow shower head, and they didn't have exactly, but they had this beautiful little device. And I talk about utility as beauty, $7. What it does is I put this on to replace the other shower head. It's not particularly pretty. It looks like any typical shower head, but I don't know if you guys can see this. There's a little valve, a flip valve, right? A metal thing. And so the idea is you soap yourself up, right? You get wet, you soap yourself up, you flip the valve up, and you reduce all to, little more to no water flow coming out of that shower head. What's the advantage of that? Well, I think for most people, one of the reasons they don't want to turn off the water is because then you have to turn it back on again. It's like hot, hot, cold, cold, and you're trying to get used to it. This keeps the water the same temperature. You only cut off it coming through the pipe, right? So it's still there the same temperature, soap up, turn it back on, and the water comes back on. So you save electricity, you save water, right, and for yourself, and you're saving water for the environment. $7, a great little investment. So that, right, can be a huge savings too. And as far as toilet flushing is concerned, one of the things people have started using, that's okay, you poor thing, you're on and off lights, don't worry about that. One of the things people have started doing is they're now making toilets where you can have a regulated water flow in or out based on what's in the system, right? So you have a big button, as I say, and a little button, right? And then you can take it from there. And so that regulates the amount of water that you cause to go through the system. People, when they turn on their hot water, they turn on the hot and then they turn on cold to counteract the hot because the hot's too hot. Isn't that true? Don't we do that? I mean, it's so common. It's like hot water, let me turn on some cold. If you lower it to 120 degrees, and mine's lowered to the point where it's hot enough that it does dishes and things like that. It doesn't scald my hands, but I don't have to add cold to that to counteract the heating effect, so you save money. Lower it 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you can save up to $150 per year just by lowering the temperature on the thermostat on your hot water heater. Okay? Once again, translating this every other time flushing, $90 per year and 3,500 gallons of water by flushing only half as many times. Even more so, right, if you make it more than that. You can save $60 per year by fixing one drip water leak. And I don't have the exact time of how often it drips, but it means it's not a running line. It's just a drip, drip, drip. So you're saving water and you're saving money. You can save $35 over the life of new types of light bulbs that are out there. And I don't know if anybody's seen these, right? In the stores they're being sold now. We call them compact fluorescent bulbs. Have you seen these? The kind of interesting, strange looking little bulbs with kind of the swirly idea. While compact fluorescent bulbs, like some of these things, cost a little more up front, each compact fluorescent bulb has a lifespan of anywhere from 5 to 7 years per bulb. I bought my home 2 years ago. There were compact fluorescent bulbs in it. I've not replaced a single bulb that was compact fluorescent since I moved in. What's the advantage of these? You replace them less often, and a lot of energy used in lighting in your homes, incandescent lights, the regular light bulbs that we have, a whole lot of energy is lost as heat, right? As heat. And because it takes a lot of heat to heat the element up. These don't operate that way, so they take about 1/6 as much energy as a regular light bulb, and they last a whole lot longer. And they cost, like I said, a little more up front. Oh, time. Okay. All right. So I'm at the very end here, okay. And there's just a few more if anybody's interested, right? The savings regarding your automobiles, okay. $150 per year is keep your car tuned and tires properly inflated. $630 per year by driving a little less than 60 miles an hour, 5 miles per hour less, and regulating your speed. So it's not so much the start and stop, the rapid start and the rapid stopping. And lastly is what we call, and educators should like this, right? What we call closing the environmental loop these days, right? Closing the loop means if we're doing these things, then we want to concentrate on buying sustainable, recycled, and recyclable, environmentally friendly products. If it's agricultural supplies, cleaning products, household supplies, office supplies, building materials, energy efficient products and appliances, wherever you might use them, when we close the loop, we sort of come full circle around and we see then more of these products being offered, right, which tends to ultimately lower cost of those. All right, lastly, right, don't be overwhelmed. No one's perfect, right? We work in baby steps. Implement a little one thing, 2 things at a time, whatever you can afford and be comfortable with. Be practical. Maybe you want to grow a garden this summer, right? Maybe you want to buy some food in bulk, get with your neighbors or family relatives, buy in larger quantities. Share what you learn is really important these days. Seek compliance from your family, your friends, right, your community. And lastly, right, these are just a couple of quotes, right, from Aldo Leopold, right, who was an avid writer about nature and natural resources. He said, conservation is the positive exercise of skill and insight, not just an exercise of abstinence or caution. So view conservation a different way. And Leopold wrote, we abuse land because we view it as a commodity that belongs to us, rather than a community to which we belong and are a part of. Once we view it that way, then we may begin to use it with love and respect. So that's the idea, and it's not a new one. It's been around for a long time, all right? Here we are, right? Thank you, and I hope everybody has, a beautiful green springs.